Well, as you'll soon find out, I take a very different perspective than Barry's. I really like Barry's work. I recommend it to you. I've learned a lot from reading it. So my perspective is different, but it's not as though I'm going to contradict what he said. As advertised, I'm a philosopher, and a legal philosopher, and I think I spend more time in the real world than most philosophers. Some have never set foot there. They're allergic to facts, and I like to think that I actually enjoy reading facts, and some of them Barry has presented. So I want to present a philosophical perspective and see what you think. Very different from what you've just heard. So what do philosophers think about whether we are punishing violent criminals too much? Incidentally, before I begin, I want to make three sort of preliminary comments. One is, like any respectable philosopher, I'm going to ask more questions and I'll give you answers. At least you'll have an idea about why philosophers, at any rate, find this topic so incredibly difficult. So that's one point. Secondly, I am aware that a lot of people find philosophy a waste of time. They don't like this approach. They want numbers, they want figures, and that's, I mean, I'm obviously in disagreement, but there are a lot of smart people who have that attitude. So some eyes will glaze here, and I'm used to that. But others find this approach fascinating. Obviously, I'm on that side, and I won't ask for a show of hands when I'm done. The third thing I wanted to say as a preliminary point is that my own perspective on this topic isn't so very idiosyncratic among philosophers who think about these topics. So obviously, I have my own spin, and philosophers disagree on details notoriously, but the overall framework, I think, is pretty widely accepted among philosophers of criminal law, and that's how I describe myself. Okay, so let's begin. Strap yourself in. To decide whether we overpunish or underpunish or punish violent criminals, we need to somehow figure out just what the appropriate level is, and there's no real agreement about how we should do that. So we need a theory, and we need principles, and those principles are very much in dispute. So let's try two different perspectives, which are pretty different. First, I think we could be non-instrumentalists about this. So punishments should be fair, they should be deserved, they should be just. What does that mean? Well, that means they should conform to a principle of retributive justice. So what is that? What is retributive justice? Well, there's a lot of disagreement there. I've got a version of that. I'll save you the time of reading Aristotle and give you my own formulation. The cornerstone of a principle of retributive justice is a principle of proportionality. Lots of formulations of that. Here's mine. The severity of the punishment should be a function of the seriousness of the crime. So let me say that again. Make sure you catch it. The severity of the punishment should be a function of the seriousness of the crime. That's what proportionality requires. So that's a very hard principle to apply, and a very hard principle to give any content to, and it's easy to see why. To apply that principle, you need three very difficult determinations, or let's call them normative theories. You need, first of all, a theory of crime seriousness. What makes one crime more serious than another? And then you need a theory of punishment severity. You need to decide what makes one punishment more severe than another. And then you need a function that maps the first theory to the second theory. And that's also very complicated. These are really difficult problems about which there's lots of disagreement. And so if you want to know whether you overpunish, underpunish, punish just the right amount, you need to get your hands dirty with three very difficult determinations if you take this non-instrumentalist approach that I just sketched. Let me just say something about crime seriousness. And you need a theory of crime seriousness, as I said, to give any content to the principle of proportionality if you want to be conceptualizing this problem according to principles of retributive justice, all very high-sounding words, I suppose. So you need a theory of crime seriousness. Oh, well, here's a start. One crime is more serious than another, depending upon the interplay between three variables: harm, wrongdoing, and culpability. So it is in virtue of those three variables that one crime is more serious than another. They interact in a very complicated way, but that's what makes one crime more serious than another, is to be analyzed according to those three variables. Now, I wanted to highlight that because there's an automatic assumption that many people make that violent crimes are more serious than nonviolent crimes. It may be true, it may be false, but if in fact crime seriousness is a function of harm, culpability, and wrongdoing, then we have to ask why a violent crime would generally always be more serious than a nonviolent crime. Is it because it's more wrongful? Is it worse, other things being equal, to be violent? Is it more harmful, other things being equal, to be violent? Frankly, I think that's a very difficult question that few people seem to tackle. It's just assumed that violence is somehow other than and has to be thought of differently than nonviolence. And again, that may be true. It's not obviously true why that should be so. So that's one of the many issues that I say I will give you without really trying to answer it. It's not as though I have nothing to say about these questions, but I'll just ask the questions today and leave the answers to those who are wiser. Okay, so you can then be puzzled about how important or weighty a principle of proportionality is in your overall political theory. So it might just be that conforming to principles of justice is just too difficult. It's too expensive. Lots can go wrong. And let me just mention three things. No, this is not news. First of all, implementing principles of retributive justice and applying a principle of proportionality is extraordinarily expensive, funded by tax dollars. And so tax dollars are scarce, and the opportunity costs of funding criminal justice are high. You could invest in schools. You can save taxpayers' money. There's all kinds of nice things you can do with your money. So is justice all that important? Even if you know how to bring it about, people can disagree about how important justice is relative to other things that are also clearly important, like education. Almost no one thinks that's unimportant. And what else goes wrong? Well, by implementing principles of retributive justice, of course, you make possible mistakes. People make mistakes. They screw up. They punish people unjustly, even though they're trying very hard to get things right, because this is very hard. And of course, some people aren't trying so hard to get things right. People are abusive, and that's certainly worrisome. You empower officials who then can be abusive, and we all know that that's a big problem. So one wonders how much it's worth relative to other goods to spend money on institutions of criminal justice. And that's maybe a question of how important is justice if you think you know what justice is relative to other variables. So those are really difficult questions. Philosophers disagree about those matters. All right, so another approach you can take is to become an instrumentalist. You can decide what the objectives of punishing people are, what the objectives of punishment is, the objectives are, and then you can decide whether we impose too much of it to achieve those objectives. Maybe we overpunish and our punishments are inefficacious. We don't need them to pursue whatever objectives we decide we have, and no one likes inefficacious punishments. There's not many people who stand up for them. So we then need to get more in line with the sort of data, the empirical approach that we just heard and that most criminologists take. But to apply this kind of reasoning, we have to decide what our legitimate objectives are before we can decide whether we are pursuing them effectively. And I think all too often people simply assume that the only legitimate objective is crime prevention, deterrence, general or special. And almost surely, I think, other objectives are very important too, but I often believe get too little attention in the way the public and even academics tend to think about this. So, most philosophers, I think, agree that punishment has what I'll call an expressive dimension. It's designed, I think, when done correctly, to express condemnation and impose stigma. So think of, think of a public figure who wasn't punished, but many people thought should have been punished. So let me pick on Bill Cosby, okay? So Bill Cosby, of course, didn't get punished yet, and a lot of people are very unhappy about that. And why? Is it because they think, well, we need more deterrence? I doubt if Bill Cosby is going to be up to the things that he's accused of having done. Probably those days are over. We don't get more deterrence, I think, by punishing him. And yet people who probably agree, yeah, that's right, we don't need to deter by punishing. But still, they're unhappy with the result because they think that he did something that deserves condemnation and stigmatization. And so it is that dimension of punishment that I take very seriously, and we should take seriously as well how important that aspect of punishment is relative to deterrence. A lot of disagreement about that as well, but it seems to me to be important. And there are lots and lots of thought experiments philosophers like to construct about a desert island where Hitler in 1950 had managed to escape the bunker, and now he's living happily. And we're not really worried about the starting of the Fourth Reich or anything. Hitler is an old man, and he's not going to ever rise again. And yet, there's something that kind of bothers you about the perspective, about the idea that he'd be unpunished for the most villainous acts that probably anyone in history has ever perpetrated. So something about that is supposed to be objectionable, and I find that objectionable. And so what's objectionable about it has nothing to do with deterrence. So if you're on board, you realize deterrence isn't really all we're up to. Something else matters too, and then we can argue about that and try to figure out what we think and how our thoughts about the expressive condemnation, stigmatization dimension of punishment plays in and relates to the deterrence aspect. Okay, so it's because I think that punishment has this expressive dimension that it's so very hard to bring down the rate of incarceration. I've been on panels, how do we bring down the rate of incarceration? Well, everybody, most people are on board with doing that. Not so easy to do. We could certainly keep crime to a respectable minimum without so much incarceration, I think most people believe. And we can do that while continuing to punish. But punishment, obviously, isn't synonymous with incarceration. There are lots of alternative modes of punishment. And so why not use those more and incarcerate less? We could still punish, but incarcerate less and do something else more. The difficulty, I think, is that it's really hard to find alternatives to incarceration that stigmatize serious criminals to the extent we want to do that. And the public really dislikes alternatives that are thought to be insufficiently stigmatizing, not because of deterrence, I think, but because they don't convey enough stigma. Largely, think about the public attitude about white-collar criminals. And so we don't punish them enough. Is it really deterrence? We could fine them astronomical amounts, we do, and yet people worry about whether that's something that we should do. Last comment, very briefly, what are we to do in light of all these questions? Well, here's a meta principle. It's sort of a default rule that I rather like. Like anything else, it's controversial. When in doubt, don't punish. And there's a lot of doubts. So when in doubt, don't punish, or don't punish very severely. That seems like a good approach to me. Of course, there are a lot of doubts, so I tend to be pretty under-punitive, but that's a principle that competes with other principles that I think are also candidate, not silly principles like better safe than sorry. There's a principle, and they compete. So lots of questions, very few answers. That's what you can expect when you invite a philosopher to address them.